Let me start with something that might make you uncomfortable. If you're listening to this in your 40s or 50s, there is a quiet pressure around you that most people never talk about. A pressure to settle, to not be alone, to prove, maybe to your family, maybe to society, maybe to yourself, that you're still desirable, still chosen. In my consultation room, I often see people who didn't come because they were happy in their relationship. They came because something inside them felt wrong, but they couldn't explain why. And almost always, it started with a decision that felt logical at the time, but emotionally, neurologically, it wasn't. This is something no one warns you about when it comes to relationships later in life. As a doctor and a clinical psychologist, I want to be very clear about one thing. This is not about saying that love after 40 is impossible, or that companionship is bad. That's not what this is. This is about understanding how your brain, your emotional system, and your life history have changed, and why the same relationship decisions you made at 25 do not work the same way at 45. What most people don't realize is that by midlife, your nervous system is no longer wired for adaptation in the same way. In your 20s and early 30s, the brain is more flexible. Psychologically, we call this higher neuroplasticity. You tolerate uncertainty better. You bend more. You compromise without feeling like you're losing yourself. But later in life, your brain has already built strong patterns around safety, routine, autonomy, and control. These patterns are not flaws. They are survival strategies shaped by decades of experience. In my practice, I often meet men and women who say, "Doctor, I thought having a partner would bring peace." But instead, they feel more anxious, more irritated, more emotionally exhausted. And this isn't because their partner is necessarily toxic. It's because their nervous system has spent years learning how to function alone. When another person enters that system too abruptly, the brain doesn't interpret it as love. It interprets it as intrusion. There's also something deeper happening emotionally. By your 40s and 50s, you are no longer searching for identity. You already know who you are. And when a relationship subtly asks you to renegotiate that identity, to adjust habits, space, silence, or freedom, it can trigger resentment instead of bonding. Many people confuse this discomfort with normal relationship problems. It's not. It's a mismatch between emotional stage and relational demand. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Some people don't choose a partner at this stage out of love. They choose out of fear. Fear of aging alone. Fear of social judgment. Fear of quiet evenings with their own thoughts. The brain, under fear, makes very convincing arguments. It tells you this is maturity, stability, the right decision. But fear-based bonding almost always turns into emotional distance, not closeness. This is why having a partner later in life can feel like safety at first, and slowly become psychological weight. And in the next part, I'll explain why familiarity and loneliness together can trick even intelligent, self-aware people into relationships that quietly drain them. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it for a moment. Have you ever noticed how loneliness in your 40s feels different from loneliness in your 20s? It's quieter, less dramatic, more rational. And that's exactly what makes it dangerous. In my consultations, people rarely say, "I was desperately lonely." Instead, they say, "It just felt practical to be with someone." That sentence alone tells me almost everything I need to know. Because when relationships are built on practicality rather than emotional truth, the consequences don't appear immediately. They show up slowly, years later, as fatigue, irritation, and a deep sense of being emotionally misplaced. What most people don't realize is that the midlife brain has learned how to soothe itself. You've built routines, coping mechanisms, and emotional shortcuts to manage stress alone. Neurologically speaking, your brain has optimized independence. So when a partner enters your life at this stage, the bonding hormones, oxytocin and dopamine, don't surge the same way they once did. Instead of excitement, the brain evaluates cost, effort, disruption. And that evaluation happens automatically without your conscious permission. I often see people confuse familiarity with compatibility. They meet someone who feels easy, same age, similar wounds, similar disappointments, and the brain relaxes, not because the connection is deep, but because it recognizes the pattern. This is something we call emotional mirroring. It feels comforting, but it's not intimacy. It's shared fatigue. Two nervous systems leaning on each other because they're tired of standing alone. Here's something no one warns you about. When you enter a relationship later in life, you are not starting from zero. You're bringing decades of emotional memory, old disappointments, unresolved grief, past betrayals that your conscious mind believes are healed, but your body remembers very well. And the body always reacts before logic does. That's why small conflicts feel disproportionately exhausting. That's why silence feels heavier. That's why compromise feels like self-erasure instead of teamwork. In my practice, I see many people who say, "There's nothing wrong, but I don't feel right." This is a classic sign of nervous system incompatibility. Your partner may be kind, stable, even supportive, but your internal system feels constantly on alert, subtly bracing itself. Over time, this creates chronic emotional tension. And chronic tension doesn't lead to love, it leads to withdrawal. Another uncomfortable truth is this. At this stage of life, many people don't want a partner, they want a buffer. Someone to soften the reality of aging, uncertainty, or mortality. But another human being cannot function as emotional anesthesia without consequences. Eventually, the brain begins to associate the relationship with pressure instead of relief. This is why relationships formed out of loneliness often feel peaceful at first and suffocating later. And in the next part, I'll talk about how identity rigidity after 40 quietly turns normal relationship dynamics into silent power struggles. Before we go any further, I want you to notice something. If parts of this feel uncomfortable, even slightly defensive, that's not resistance, that's recognition. In my consultation room, the moment someone goes quiet is often the moment something important has been touched. Because what I'm about to explain isn't about bad partners or wrong choices. It's about how identity hardens with time and how relationships later in life collide with that reality. By your 40s and 50s, your sense of self is no longer under construction. It is established. Your brain has spent decades reinforcing certain behaviors, preferences, values, and boundaries. Neuroscience tells us that repetition strengthens neural pathways. So the way you think, react, rest, argue, and withdraw has become deeply ingrained. This gives you stability, yes, but it also reduces flexibility. And relationships, whether we admit it or not, require flexibility. In younger years, compromise often feels like growth. Later in life, compromise can feel like loss. Loss of routine, loss of silence, loss of control over how you regulate your own emotions. I often hear people say, "I've worked too hard to build my peace." And that sentence is very telling. It means the nervous system has learned to prioritize predictability over connection. This is where silent power struggles begin. Not loud arguments, not dramatic fights. Quiet negotiations over space, habits, time, and autonomy. Who adapts more? Who gives up their rhythm? Who feels subtly invaded? These struggles rarely reach the surface, but they erode intimacy from underneath. Each person protects their territory, emotionally and psychologically, without realizing they've stopped bonding. There's another layer most people don't see. Midlife identity is often tied to competence and self-sufficiency. You've survived things. You've handled crises. You've proven to yourself that you can manage alone. So when a relationship requires vulnerability, real vulnerability, not polite sharing, it clashes with the self-image of being fine. Many people can talk about their past pain, but they cannot allow present dependency. And intimacy without dependency becomes emotional distance. In my practice, I see couples who function perfectly on the surface. Bills paid, responsibilities shared. No major conflict, but emotionally, they live parallel lives. This happens when two fully formed identities try to coexist without integration. The brain prioritizes self-preservation over merging. And slowly, the relationship becomes a logistical arrangement rather than an emotional one. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Later in life, many people want companionship without disruption, connection without cost, love without vulnerability. But that combination doesn't exist. When the brain senses that a relationship threatens autonomy, it quietly pulls back. Not dramatically, gradually, until one day the person says, "I feel alone, even though I'm not." This is why having a partner at this stage can feel less like union and more like negotiation. And in the next part, I'll explain why emotional fatigue, not incompatibility, is often what destroys relationships formed later in life. Let me slow this down for a moment, because what I'm about to say is something I've seen too many times to ignore. People don't usually leave relationships in their 40s or 50s because of betrayal or conflict. They leave because they are tired. Not physically tired, emotionally depleted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And when that fatigue sets in, the brain stops trying. In my consultations, I often hear, "I don't have the energy to explain myself anymore." That sentence is a red flag. It tells me the person's emotional reserves are already low. By midlife, most people are managing multiple invisible loads: career pressure, aging parents, health concerns, financial responsibility, unresolved grief, or quiet disappointment about how life turned out. The nervous system is already operating close to capacity. When a relationship is added on top of this, the brain does a calculation it never had to do before. Is this connection restoring energy or consuming it? And here's the problem. Even healthy relationships require emotional labor: listening, adjusting, reassuring, negotiating differences. When the brain is fatigued, it experiences these normal demands as stressors rather than bonding opportunities. Neuroscience shows us that chronic stress reduces emotional tolerance. Small frustrations feel bigger. Neutral comments feel critical. Silence feels loaded. This is why midlife couples often say, "We argue about nothing." It's not nothing. It's nervous system overload. Two people with limited emotional bandwidth trying to connect without enough internal space to do so. Another thing no one warns you about is grief layering. By this stage of life, almost everyone carries some form of loss: missed chances, relationships that failed, versions of themselves that never fully emerged. When you enter a new relationship, these losses don't disappear. They sit quietly in the background. And sometimes, your partner becomes the unconscious recipient of emotions that don't actually belong to them. I see this when someone says, "I don't know why I'm so irritable with them." Often, the irritation isn't about the partner at all. It's about life, about time, about the realization that certain doors are closed. The relationship becomes the nearest emotional outlet, and that's an unfair burden for any human being. Here's the uncomfortable truth. At this stage, many people are not emotionally fresh. They are emotionally worn. And worn systems struggle to create new emotional bonds. This doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. But it does mean that adding a partner can amplify exhaustion rather than relieve it. This is why some people feel lighter after leaving a relationship later in life, even if the relationship wasn't bad. The nervous system, finally gets to rest. And in the next part, I'll explain how fear of aging and mortality subtly pushes people into relationships that their emotional system cannot sustain. Let me say something quietly, because this is where many people feel exposed. In your 40s and 50s, the fear that shapes relationships is no longer the fear of being unloved. It's the fear of time. The fear that life is moving faster than you are. The fear that your body, your relevance, your options are slowly narrowing. In my consultation room, this fear rarely announces itself openly. It disguises itself as wanting stability or not wanting to be alone. But underneath, it's something far more primal. What most people don't realize is that around midlife, the brain becomes acutely aware of mortality. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, constant background awareness. Neuroscience shows that as we age, the brain's threat detection systems become more sensitive to long-term uncertainty. You start thinking in terms of permanence. Who will be there later? Who will witness my life? Who will notice if something happens to me? This is where many people make a critical mistake. They choose a partner not because the connection is emotionally nourishing, but because the relationship reduces existential anxiety. Another human being becomes a psychological anchor against the fear of aging alone. And in the short term, it works. The anxiety softens. The nights feel less quiet. The future feels less abstract. But here is the uncomfortable truth. When a relationship is built to manage fear, it quietly becomes a cage. The brain associates the partner with safety, but also with survival. And survival-based bonding is not the same as love. It creates attachment, yes, but it also creates pressure. Pressure to stay, pressure to endure, pressure to not disrupt the structure that keeps the fear at bay. In my practice, I often hear people say, "I don't think I'm happy, but I can't imagine starting over." That sentence tells me the relationship is no longer about connection. It's about containment. The brain would rather tolerate emotional dissatisfaction than face uncertainty. This is not weakness, it's biology. The nervous system prefers predictable discomfort over unpredictable freedom. Another layer to this is social comparison. Seeing peers married, settled, paired off triggers something deep. The brain interprets being unpartnered as falling behind, even if intellectually you know that's not true. And under that pressure, people lower emotional standards without realizing it. They don't choose badly, they choose defensively. Over time, this creates quiet resentment, not always toward the partner, but toward oneself, for choosing safety over authenticity, for staying out of fear rather than desire. And resentment that has nowhere to go eventually turns inward, often showing up as numbness, irritability, or a sense of emotional flatness. This is why having a partner later in life can sometimes intensify the very fears it was meant to soothe. And in the next part, I'll talk about how emotional independence, once a strength, can quietly sabotage intimacy in midlife relationships. Let me challenge a belief that many people carry with pride. I don't need anyone. On the surface, this sounds healthy, strong, mature. In your 40s and 50s, emotional independence is often seen as proof that you've evolved, and in many ways it has protected you. But in my clinical experience, this same independence is one of the most common reasons relationships later in life slowly collapse. What most people don't realize is that emotional independence and emotional intimacy use different neurological pathways. Independence strengthens self-regulation. You learn to calm yourself, make decisions alone, process disappointment internally. Intimacy, on the other hand, requires co-regulation, allowing another nervous system to influence yours. And if you've spent years perfecting self-reliance, co-regulation can feel unsafe, intrusive, or simply unnecessary. In my consultations, I often hear phrases like, "I just deal with things on my own," or I don't like to burden anyone. These sound responsible, even kind, but emotionally, they create distance. A partner can't bond with what they can't reach, and over time, the relationship begins to feel one-sided, shallow, or strangely disconnected, even if there's no conflict. There's another subtle dynamic at play. When someone has been independent for a long time, they often unconsciously test relationships. They withdraw slightly during stress. They handle problems alone. They minimize their needs. And when the partner doesn't step in, they interpret it as lack of care. But the truth is, no signal was sent. The brain assumed self-sufficiency would be understood, but intimacy doesn't work that way. This creates a quiet loop. One partner feels unnecessary, the other feels unsupported. Neither names it. And because midlife adults are often conflict avoidant, preferring peace over confrontation, the pattern continues until emotional distance feels normal. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Independence feels safe because it reduces risk. But intimacy requires risk. It requires being seen when you're not polished, needing someone when you could handle it alone. And for many people, later in life, that feels like regression, not connection. I've seen relationships where both partners are capable, intelligent, emotionally aware, and deeply lonely together. Not because they don't care, but because neither knows how to let go of the armor that once kept them alive. This is why having a partner in your 40s or 50s can feel strangely hollow. You're together, but not intertwined, close, but not connected. And in the final part, I'll explain when having a partner later in life is not a mistake, and what truly determines whether it becomes a source of peace or quiet regret. Before we end, I want you to hear this clearly. Everything you've listened to so far is not an argument against love, connection, or companionship later in life. It's a warning against entering relationships unconsciously. In my years of practice, the happiest midlife relationships I've seen were not built on fear, convenience, or social pressure. They were built on something far rarer, emotional honesty with oneself. Here's what most people don't realize. Having a partner in your 40s or 50s is not a mistake when the relationship is a choice, not a solution, not a remedy for loneliness, not a buffer against aging, not proof of worth. When two people come together without needing the relationship to fix something inside them, the nervous system relaxes rather than braces itself. In healthy later life relationships, independence is not used as armor. It's shared as respect. Each person can stand alone, but they choose to stand together. There is room for silence without withdrawal, space without threat, vulnerability without collapse, and most importantly, there is no rush, no urgency to secure the future at the cost of the present. In my consultations, I often ask one simple question. If this relationship disappeared tomorrow, would you still feel whole? When the answer is yes, the relationship is usually healthy. When the answer is no, the relationship is often carrying too much psychological weight. Another person cannot hold your fear of time, identity, or meaning without breaking under it. This is something no one teaches us. Later in life, love is not about intensity. It's about nervous system compatibility, about whether being together reduces tension or increases it, whether conversations restore energy or quietly drain it, whether you feel more yourself or less over time. The biggest mistake is not having a partner. The mistake is ignoring your internal signals, because being alone feels socially unacceptable. I've seen people thrive alone in their 50s and deteriorate in relationships that looked perfect from the outside, and I've seen others find profound peace with a partner who didn't try to complete them, only accompany them. So if you're considering a relationship later in life, don't ask, will this make me less alone? Ask, will this allow me to stay emotionally honest? Because loneliness can be managed, but living against your nervous system day after day always comes at a cost. And sometimes the bravest, healthiest choice is not to add someone to your life, but to protect the life you've already built.